Uh, okay, welcome to today's seminar. My name is Pontus Braunhielm. I'm a research director at Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum and a professor in economics at KTH and BTH. I'd like to share just a few slides with you, so just hold on here. All right, I hope you can see the slides now. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. And let me start with our keynote, Professor Philippe Aghion. He is at the Collège de France and also at London School of Economics. And he was before that at Harvard for many years. But more important than that is that he is one of the founding fathers of the so-called neo-Schumpeterian growth models that have had a tremendous impact during the last decades, both in academia, but also when it comes to policymakers. Now, if you want a more detailed account of all his achievements, I have to refer you to the net because we simply don't have time. But let me just mention one thing. In 2016, Professor Aghion received the Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research that is given out by this organization together with IFN. We also have Carolina Ekholm here, who is a professor at Stockholm University, formerly state secretary and deputy governor at the Swedish Riksbank. Well, this is the way that we should proceed. So first, Professor Aghion will give an account of his very recent book, The Power of Creative Destruction, which is co-authored with Céline Antonin and Simone Bunel. Now, this is an elegant, pedagogic, and easily understood account of creative destruction. And it covers a wide array of different aspects, not only what one may call the key pillars of creative destruction, innovation, entry, exit, etc., but also how it relates to globalization, income inequalities, civil society. There is also a comparison between the United States and more welfare-oriented nations. It even has a reference to the dramatic events in Ådalen 1931. So it's a very rich book, as you understand. After Philippe's presentation, Carolina and I will ask a few questions. And if time allows, we will also take a question from the chat. Before I hand over to Philippe, just let me bring your attention to this event that will take place in a few days' time. For those of you who want to dig more into detail when it comes to the economics of creative destruction. So this is an open Zoom conference starting on Wednesday. So with those introductory remarks, let me hand over to Professor Aghion. Please, the floor is yours, Philippe.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry for the video problem. Thank you very much, Pontus, for inviting me. Thank you so much, Carolina, for taking part in this event, and for Brit Marie for also the organization. And I will start with the presentation of the book. Okay. So, as Pontus mentioned, it's a jointly work with Céline Antonin, who is at the Observatoire Français de la Conjoncture Économique and Collège de France, and Simon Bunel, who is at the Banque de France, Central Bank of France, and Collège de France. And in fact, this book, is a result of 34 years of research that I started with Peter Howitt in the fall of 1987. And then was continued with numerous co-authors, and then by subsequent work by many people, in fact. to operationalize Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction, to develop models based on that notion and to confront these models with micro data, with new micro data sets. And in Collège de France, what you do is that you have to teach recent research, but in a way which is accessible to the public at large. The Collège de France lectures are attended by everybody. And so if you want to have a large audience, you better make the material accessible. And also every year, you have to teach a new course, new things. So over the past 5 years of teaching at Collège de France, I accumulated a lot of material, and the material was the basis of this book. Voilà, that's a bit the genesis of the book. So now the creative destruction is the process whereby new innovations displace old technologies, whereby new innovations make old technologies become obsolete. That was a notion that Schumpeter introduced, but there was no model. There was no there was no gross model based on it when I started to work on the subject, and there was no empirics. So with Peter Howitt, we built a model encompassing the three following ideas, and then this model, we elaborated it, and we in the various directions. That was our 98 book, but then it was confronted with microdata, and has been, a lot of work done in this way. The three basic ideas of what we call the Schumpeterian growth paradigm is that long-run growth is driven by cumulative process of innovation, where you build on the knowledge of predecessors, of previous innovators. The second idea is that innovations do not come from heaven. They are the result of entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovations displace old technologies, make old technologies become obsolete. And you see right away that at the heart of the Schumpeterian growth process, you have a contradiction, because on the one hand, you need innovation rents to motivate innovations. At least most innovations are motivated, at least partly, by the prospect of rents. But those rents can be used, exposed, to prevent subsequent innovations and to block subsequent entry, because of course, yesterday's innovators, they don't want to be replaced by tomorrow's innovators. And so they may use the rents that they got by innovating, but to prevent subsequent innovation. And regulating capitalism is a lot about dealing with this contradiction. In fact, this contradiction runs through the whole book, The Power of Creative Destruction, that I'm now presenting. Any aspect, be it competition, inequality, green innovation, secular stagnation, the middle income trap, all those things run again at the heart of it. You have this contradiction, that back and back again. In fact, Schumpeter himself was deeply pessimistic about the future of capitalism. He thought that the first innovators would turn into conglomerates, and that the conglomerates would successfully manage to prevent any subsequent innovation. So Schumpeter thought that capitalism was doomed. But in fact, the book is about why Schumpeter was maybe too pessimistic, why his prophecy did not come true. In fact, we substitute to Schumpeter's pessimism what we call optimism of the will, fighting optimism. In French, we say optimisme de combat. That means that things may turn wrong, but there are forces that can make it turn right, and that can avert the Schumpeter prediction. And I will talk about that in the book. Now, creative destruction.
Philippe, may I interrupt you just 1 second? There seems to be some problem with the volume. If you can raise your volume, if that is possible.
Even volume is not good. Oh la la. You want me to start from scratch again?
No, I think you can continue.
Like this is better?
I hear you loud and clear now.
Okay. You want me to start from the beginning?
I think you can go on from the picture where you stopped now.
Okay. So creative destruction is not just a concept.
Continue, yes.
Yeah. So I was saying that at the heart of the growth process, you have the contradiction that innovations are motivated by the prospect of innovation rents, but because of creative destruction, yesterday's innovators want to use those rents to prevent subsequent innovation that would destroy their position. And regulating capitalism is about managing this contradiction. That's what I was saying before. So creative destruction is not just a concept, it's a reality. One way to capture it is by the flow of patents. Here is a picture which is due to Aksigit Grigsby and Nicholas in a paper on American ingenuity. And they showed a positive correlation between the flow of patents yearly and the average growth of GDP per capita. States in the US that on average patent more per year over the 20th century are also states that experience the highest rate of per capita GDP growth on average yearly over the same century. Okay, so one way to measure creative destruction is by the flow of patents, which is the flow of innovation. Another way to measure creative destruction is by the job creation, job destruction, firm creation, firm destruction. And again, these measures of creative destruction are positively correlated with per capita GDP growth. So you have various ways to measure creative destruction. Also, what goes with creative destruction is the fact that you have a life cycle of firms. Firms have, the left-hand side shows the rate of growth of employment in a firm. When the firm is young, you have a high rate of employment growth, but then the employment stabilizes. That's part of the creative destruction. Firms grow and then they stabilize. Also, the picture on the right shows the exit rate of firms by age, or young firms exit much more than old firms. Small firms exit much more than old firms, than big firms. Now, what the book does is to use the lens of creative destruction and of the paradigm I outlined above to do three things. The first one is to revisit some main enigmas in economic history, in the history of growth. The second is to question some common wisdoms on how to design growth policy. And the third one is to rethink the future of capitalism. So let me deal with each of these three aspects of the book in turn. So let's talk first about the enigma. The first enigma is the industrial takeoff. Why did industrial takeoff? You know, this is per capita GDP worldwide. And that's due to Madison. You know, Madison was working at the OECD, assembled information that allowed him to reconstitute, you know, the history of growth worldwide. And you see, there isn't much going on until 1800. In chapter 2 of the book, we mentioned that there are episodes like Venice or like, you know, some various places in the world experience temporary growth, you know, because of trade, because of some inventions, but it was never long lasting. The real takeoff of growth is only 200 years old. It's 1820 in England first, and then later on in France, and later on in the US. And Joël Mokyr in particular explains very well why in Europe and why so late. And that brings us back to the paradigm, to the Schumpeterian paradigm that I outlined above, which is here. First thing you need long-run growth is driven by cumulative innovation. Well, the conditions existed in Europe because you had universities, because you had the printing, because you had postage, the progress in postal services, and because you had the Encyclopedia, Diderot and the Encyclopedia Britannica that would codify knowledge. Therefore, you would not have to reinvent each time. You could build on the codified knowledge of your predecessors. And it was very important to have all this set of institutions that made the process of knowledge cumulative. You could build on the giant shoulders of your predecessor. So that's the first aspect. The second thing is that you needed to protect property rights on an innovation, which led to the patent system in particular. In England, protection of property rights was made possible by the Glorious Revolution. In France, it was the French Revolution and then Bonaparte, Napoleon, that codified, you know, that really secured the protection of property rights. That was also a key aspect if you want innovators to be rewarded and to be anticipated that they have secured reward on their innovation. And the third one was creative destruction. The big problem, and some of you know, people have written on that. For example, in China, there were inventors but never take off because the emperors were afraid that the inventors would become too powerful. So always managed to make sure that the innovators would not be too powerful. In Europe, if you would persecute a scientist or an inventor, it would always move to the neighboring country, which is competing with your country. And that's where the fact that you had cross-country competition in Europe was something that made, you know, that averted this Chinese syndrome that I just described and made creative destruction sustainable. And so you see that's very interesting because to explaining the takeoff is very much mapping the Schumpeterian growth paradigm that I outlined here, which was the basis of the model I developed with Howitt. Okay, so then the second enigma is technological waves and their effect on employment. So for example, the wave, you know, here, if you look at the dotted line here, you have here the culminant of the electricity wave in the US, and here is the IT wave in the US. But you have the steam engine wave, which was somewhere here before. And there is always a lag between the invention of the general purpose technology and the wave itself. The steam engine was invented long before the steam engine turned into a wave. The bulb, the electric bulb, was invented long before you had this culminant of the electricity wave. And why the delay? Well, the delay is because, you know, to diffuse a basic innovation, you need to do many secondary innovations in all sectors. And there you have incumbents who resist, you know, the replacement of existing technologies by the new general purpose technology. So you again find the Schumpeter contradiction explaining the delay in the wave and the delay also in the diffusion of the wave between, for example, the US and the Europe. That's the culminant in Japan and Europe of the electricity wave, which is much delayed compared to the US. And again, there we explain in the book in chapter 3 why institutional considerations play an important role there. There is another enigma with the wave is that each time you have the technological revolution, it was anticipated that they would lead to mass unemployment. With a steam engine, you have the Luddites movement in England. The Luddites were these workers which were worried that they would become redundant because of the steam engine machines. And in fact, none of the sort happened at the time. There was never mass unemployment in England when they introduced the steam engine. Similarly, when you had the electricity wave in the US, Keynes was predicting mass unemployment, which never occurred. And in fact, I will get back to that, but in fact, I'll show you that firms that automate, they create employment, in fact. Even though there is some substitution, some manpower is replaced by machines, overall, firms that automate, they create employment, they create jobs, and I will explain later on why. Another enigma is the secular stagnation. You see, here I'm showing the average yearly rate of growth of TFP in the US. And you see that they had a 95-2005 growth went up a lot and then went down a lot since 2005, at the time where you have the artificial intelligence revolution, which in principle should boost growth. So that's an enigma. Why is it that when you have the IT and then AI revolution, you have this decline in productivity growth in the US, but also in other countries? That's a big enigma. And what's very interesting, particularly in IT producing in black and IT using in gray, that sectors, that you have this up and down of growth. And you want to understand why. And that has to do again with the contradiction, because what happened is that between 95, you know, you had, as of 95, you had the IT wave. The IT revolution allowed superstar firms like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Walmart. These big firms expanded a lot. They were more productive than other firms. So when they expanded, first, it led to this boost of growth. But then when they expanded everywhere, that's why we explain in recent work with Pete Clino, Timo Boppard, Huey Lee, and Antonin Bergeau, we explain why once they expand everywhere, they inhibit innovations by other firms. And that's why you have the secular stagnation. So it's again the conflict. Yesterday's innovator become you know, a break to subsequent innovation. And the question is how you adapt competition policy to revert the movement, you know, to put an end to the decline. And in fact, there in chapter 6 of the book, we discuss how competition policy, if it's properly adapted to the digital era, can in fact make growth resume in the US and in advanced countries. You see, there it's a problem of competition policy not being adapted to the digital revolution. And what could you do to make sure that the innovators of yesterday, the superstar firms I was talking about, won't keep preventing new innovations happening? So another enigma is the middle income trap. Here I show the GDP per capita of Argentina as a ratio divided by the GDP per capita of the US. And you see that more or less between 1870 and 1930, per capita GDP growth is the same in Argentina as it is in the US. But then since 1930, the per capita GDP growth of Argentina is less than that of the US. So it looked like Argentina was doing well up to a certain point, then stopped doing well. But you have other examples worldwide. You have South Korea, which grew very fast between World War II and the 1990s, and then grew much slower in the 1990s. You have Japan, which is not middle income, it's an advanced country. Japan grew very fast between World War II and the late 80s, but then Japan started growing much more slowly. And there the view is that during the catching up period, that the growth of Japan post-World War II, of Korea, of Argentina here, was a catching up growth. They had institutions that were adapted to catching up with the technological frontier. But then at some moment, it becomes important to move to institutions that favor frontier innovation and that are much more pro-competition. But the problem is that during the catching up period, you have big conglomerates that develop. In Korea, these conglomerates are called chaebols. In Japan, they are called keiretsus. These big conglomerates, not only they inhibit new entry and new innovation, but they also prevent governments, they put pressure on governments not to do the institutional reforms that would be required in order to become a frontier innovator. In particular, move towards much more competition and much more trade liberalization. And those moves were stalled by these big conglomerates colluding with the state. And again, you find Schumpeter's contradiction there, but it's very much at another level. It's that the existing innovators collude with the state to prevent necessary changes in policies and institutions. So that's finally, another enigma. So we deal with the secular stagnation, chapter 6, middle income trap, chapter 7. In chapter 5, we talk about inequality. And there is this very interesting figure, which is drawn from joint work with Ufuk Eksigit, Antonin Bergeaud, Richard Blandel, and David Emus, where we look at the effect of innovation on various measures of inequality, of income inequality. One measure of income inequality is the top income inequality, the share of income of the top 1% who earn the most. And then you have a more global measure of inequality, which is the Gini coefficient, which is how far you are from perfect equality globally for the economy as a whole. And you see that in a more, here it's cross-state US panel. So the same state can be here or there, depending on the year you are considering. But you see that there is a positive association. In fact, it's a positive causation from innovation intensity measured by patenting, by the flow of patents or the flow of citations, and top income share. That means that states that innovate more generates a higher share of income for the top 1%. That's very much in line with the basic Schumpeterian paradigm that I get back to. We know that innovation are associated with entrepreneurial rents. So when you innovate, you generate rents, which the innovator gets, but also shared within the firm. In chapter 10, we explain how innovation rents are shared within the firm, with the entrepreneur, with other co-workers. So you provide rents not only to yourself, innovator, but to people working with you or employing you. But on the other hand, you see, you have creative destruction. New innovation displaces old technologies. And that explains why you don't have, why innovation does not affect global inequality. Because it's true that on the one hand, innovation feeds the top income inequality. But on the other hand, it's, the innovation generates creative destruction. And creative destruction is a source of social mobility. And the social mobility goes towards more equality. So that's why when you look at the effect of innovation on the Gini, you find no effect because you have these two opposite forces of innovation on inequality. On the one hand, innovation increases the share of income of the top 1%, but on the other hand, innovation increases social mobility. And when it increases social mobility, that's again from the same paper with Bergeaud, Blandel, Bergeaud, Blandel, Eksigit, and Emus, where we show that we'll use the Chetty et al. Measures of social mobility across commuting zones in the US. Commuting zones that are more innovation intensive tend to be, if I had to draw a straight line here, would be clearly an upward sloping line. More innovative commuting zones are also commuting zones that display higher social mobility. So you see, that's what's very interesting with innovation. It's true that innovation contributes to top income inequality. Mr. Skype in Sweden became rich because of Skype, okay? Didn't exist 25 years ago. But on the other hand, because innovation generates social mobility, it doesn't affect global inequality. So it's a good source of top income because innovation, it generates growth, generates social mobility, does not increase global inequality. That's unlike lobbying. We explain in the book that lobbying is very different. Lobbying also contributes to top income inequality, but lobbying reduces social mobility because it's entry barriers that you put when you do lobbying to new innovators. It reduces social mobility. It reduces growth because you prevent new innovations, and it increases global inequality. So I say always that Steve Jobs and Carlos Slim is not the same thing. You can become rich like Steve Jobs became rich, or you can become rich like Carlos Slim in Mexico became rich because he became head of an unregulated monopoly in telecom. And those are not the same way, and you cannot treat them. And existing literature on inequality, no name there, believe that everybody is a Carlos Slim, but you also have Steve Jobs. So you have to take that into account when you think about taxation or about how making growth more inclusive. Okay, so that's the first part. It's questioning, it's about enigma. Now, the second thing that the book does is to question common wisdoms. The first common wisdom is that you should tax robots to protect employment. But in fact, you see, recent work that I've done with my co-authors on the book, plus Javier Jaravel, shows that firms and plants in France that automate, they create employment. And why they create employment is because, in fact, they become more competitive. It allows them to reduce price, in particular export prices, and therefore to increase sales. So when you automate, you become more competitive, you increase your market share worldwide, therefore you increase the demand for your product, therefore you demand yourself more employment. So there is, of course, some substitution, some machines substitute for manpower, but the productivity effect is much more than counteracts the substitution effect. And that's why overall, firms that automate create employment. Taxing robots would mean discouraging, would amount to discouraging innovation by these firms, and therefore to prevent them from creating employment. So taxing robots, you shoot yourself in the feet because you prevent these firms that create employment from creating as much employment and from doing as much improvement in their productivity and competitiveness. So that's a bad idea that we kill in the book in chapter 3. Another idea is that taxation is the only instrument to make growth more inclusive. I want to make clear there, I believe very much in taxation. You need to pay for very high quality schooling, free for everybody and high quality. You need to pay for a health system, high quality, accessible to everybody. I'm very much, the Scandinavian model, okay? You need to pay for flex security like they do in Denmark. I'm very fond of that system. You need to pay for smartly done industrial policy. For all that, you need taxation, and you need progressive taxation. So I'm not at all a non-taxation person. I am in favor of taxation, and I applauded the G7 decision to align, to have a minimal tax rate on companies of 15% worldwide. So I'm all for that, but it's not the only way. Innovation is also, as I said, an engine of inclusive growth. I told you already that, particularly innovation by entrance, we show in that paper, is a source of social mobility, mostly innovation by entrance. So, but also it turns out, and that's work I'm doing currently with Antonin Bergeaud, Richard Blondel, and Rachel Griffiths, showing that innovating firms, that's on UK data, but we find the same on French data, innovating firms, they pay higher wages to low-educated, even to low-educated. Here I'm looking at the wage of a low-educated worker over time. And you see the continuous line is an innovating firm that patents. The dotted line is a non-innovating firm that does not patent. The innovating firm gives a better career prospect with the age of the worker. You see that higher wage and steeper wage profile for a worker in an innovating firm than a non-innovating firm. So innovation not only is because of creative destruction that is good for social mobility and inclusiveness, but also because innovative firms provide more what I call good jobs, jobs that qualify, jobs that entail a steeper wage profile and longer tenure. And that's why taxing is good, but if you overtax capital and firms, then of course you may discourage innovation, and that you would shoot yourself in the feet, because not only it's bad for growth, but it's also bad for inclusiveness. And there, on the tax reform, I advise Macron to do a tax reform exactly emulating the tax reform that you did in Sweden in the early 1990s. I know you did several things at the same time, and you know very well that the tax reforms you did in the early 1990s contributed a lot to boosting innovation and productivity growth in Sweden. The third on taxation also, I want to say that I mentioned taxation, I mentioned innovation. Competition policy is also very important. I told you in the US, the problem is that you have the superstar firms concentrating rents and stalling growth. Their competition policy is also very important to make sure that you resume creative destruction and that rents go down and growth goes up. The competition policy is a very important element. And it's no problem for me to have rich people, but I don't want the rich to prevent competition and prevent new entry. And competition policy is also an important tool to make sure that happens. Another aspect is also the financing of political campaigns. You know that in the US, firms, since Mr. Scalia allowed for that at the Supreme Court, you know that in the US, firms can finance political campaigns with no limit. You know very well that in Sweden, in Scandinavia, but in Europe, in France as well, we have very strict regulation for the financing of political campaigns. I think that's very important. You don't want incumbent firms to run the show. And all those things are also important. Taxation important, but also innovation, competition policy, of course, education. And I will get back to education. Education is a primordial, is very important. If you want inclusive growth, you need high quality education accessible to all. I will get back to that later. So you have several instruments to make growth more inclusive, not only taxation, of course taxation, but not only taxation. Protectionism is the way to regain control of value chains. Well, no, because look, here is Germany versus France. It's what I call the anti-COVID products. It's masks, tests, and respirators. If you look, Germany is the black curve, France is the gray curve. If you look at early 2000s, Germany was a little bit above France. The triangles are exports, the circles are imports. But you see that now Germany exports and imports way more than France, but they also import more. They have a trade surplus of 20 billion euros in masks, tests, and respirators, but France did not take off. They outsourced, but you see, Germany is doing much better now than France, and not because they put tariff barriers, not because they engaged in trade wars, it's because they innovated and industrialized, and that's, I think, is a much better way. Because the problem, if you do the trade war, for example, as a response to the China shock, import shock, is that the destination country will retaliate, and if the destination country retaliates, that will restrict your export markets. But we show in the book that restricting export markets, stalls innovation, because innovations are encouraged by the market share, by market size. And if countries close their markets to my products, that will discourage me from innovating. I innovate more when I have more export markets. I innovate more when I know that I can export to more markets. So if I trigger retaliation by trade wars, in fact, domestic firms will end up innovating less because they will see export markets shrinking, and therefore the ability to earn rents on their innovation shrinking as well. So that you have to be very careful. Not that you should never use the threat of tariffs. You should use the threat of tariffs against pollution havens, against tax havens, against social dumping. But you should be very careful when you do that because you may trigger retaliations. A much more effective way to control the value chains is to industrialize through innovation in particular. And that's what we discussed in chapter 13. Then there is another common wisdom that we discussed, is that zero or negative growth would be the best response to the climate challenge. I don't know what Thunberg believes on that, says on, but we had a very nice natural experiment. The first lockdown March, April, May 2020 in France meant that GDP went down 30%, but CO2 emissions went down by only 8%. That shows that's a very nice natural experiment showing that the way out, the way to respond to the climate challenge is not so much to do zero or negative growth, is to do green growth. And the problem, so here you have green patents, polluting patents in automobile. Alors, if you continue there, they get closer over the past years. Because that was drawn from a paper in the JP where we were not going beyond 2005. Now we can go all the way to 2017. So the good news is that these two curves are getting closer to one another. The continuous line is the green patents, electric cars, in particular in automobile, and the dotted line is the combustion engines patents. But what's the best way is, the problem is that firms that have innovated in dirty technologies in the past, they tend to continue innovating in dirty technology in the future. We showed that in empirical work with John Van Reenen, Ralph Martin, David Emus in the JPE that I presented in Stockholm in 2012 with John Van Reenen. And so you have what we call path dependence in the direction of technical change. That's again an incumbency problem. So ideally, if you want to go to green growth, favor entry of new firms because they don't have that incumbency problem. So that's already one way to do. Already by favoring new startups, new firms coming, by boosting creative destruction, already you are dealing with a green growth problem. But there is also other things you can do. The carbon tax, for example, is a way to redirect technical change of incumbent firms towards green technologies. And also, I would say, industrial policy and subsidies to green R&D. That also is very effective. Create the equivalent of the ARPA energy in the US. That's a very effective way to also redirect technical change. And also, as we explained in the book, chapter 9, all that, consumers play a big role. In countries where there is awareness about the environmental problem, competition and makes firms innovate greener because consumers will go to your competitor if you don't go greener, if you don't produce greener, or if you don't use greener inputs, then information will go through Bitcorps and other type of information will in fact reach consumers, and consumers will decide that they will no longer consume from your products, but they will shift to greener producers. So we show how consumers play also a very important role, and of course competition there is very important because if there was no competition and the consumer has no choice but purchasing my own products, I could afford to be polluting. But if I am in a competitive environment and consumers want green products, I rather go green and innovate green. Otherwise, they will talk to my competitors. So you see, that's a very effective force. As important, we show that in work with Benabou, Roulet, and Martin. We show that this is as important as the carbon price to induce green innovation. So you see, you have. So that's what I wanted just to. And the third thing that we do in the book is to provide some guidelines to rethink capitalism. In fact, COVID was a revelator. It revealed how broken the social model is in the US, but it also revealed how inadequate the innovation ecosystem is in Europe. So let me talk about that. Let me talk about the social model. In the US, Anne Case and Angus Deaton have shown the drama of the middle-aged 50-54 non-Hispanic whites, and here they show what they call the death of despair. So that's taken from Case and Deaton. And that's this curve. You see, I mean, there has been a sharp increase in death of despair. Death of despair means that you die from suicide or substance abuse. You take too many opioids or other things or antidepressants. And if you abuse from these, the consumption of these, the mortality rate goes up a lot. And that's in the US. Whereas, the death rate, there is no such thing in other developed countries. That's what this graph shows. And in the US, when you lose your job, it's a drama for your family. It often creates job insecurity, induces family instability, And all that contributes to this increase in mortality. Let me contrast that with Denmark, and that's the work of Alexandra Roulet, all that is done in chapter 11 of the book. Alexandra compares the health of Danish workers whose place of employment closes between 2001 and 2006 to identical workers whose employment place doesn't close within that period. Okay, so identical workers mean workers that are identical with respect to age, experience, skills. And you see, so it's a diff and diff for those who are the jargon estimation. And you see what's nice is that at time zero, is the closure of the firm. And you see that there is no, it does not impact probability of purchasing antidepressants or anti-anxiety or sleeping pills. So in Denmark, you lose your job, no effect on consumption of drugs, no effect on the probability of visiting hospital for circulatory disease. And if I didn't show mortality, no effect on mortality either. So that's the superiority of the Danish model over the US model. Now, let me show you also COVID itself. When COVID occurred in the US, unemployment went up. But with unemployment going up, a number of people lost their lost health insurance. And you see that here, there is a substantial increase in the share of population in the US without health insurance. At the time, they would need health insurance. Similarly, if you look at risk of getting into poverty, the risk of going into poverty here in the US goes up with COVID. Doesn't change in Germany. I could show Sweden instead of Germany. It would be the same comparison between Sweden on the one hand and US on the other hand. So you see, overall, the US social model is very bad. That's why Biden is right to do what he does. I know Larry Summers went against Biden. I don't agree with Larry Summers. I completely agree with Biden. In the US, there was need for emergency help. Many people who are in distress, you needed to go quickly to relieve them. They didn't have the protection that you have in Sweden and we have in France, okay? On the other hand, the flip side is that the US is a more innovative economy. Let me show you the patents, the biotech patents. This is the number of biotech patents per million inhabitants in the US. Is way higher than the average EU 27 or average OECD. So they produce much more patents. And I could I could zoom on triadic patents or highly cited patents. There, it's even more overwhelming the superiority of US vis-a-vis the rest of the world, okay? And why is that? It's because you see the US, they have a fantastic ecosystem of innovation. We explain that in chapter 12 of the book. In bio, they have only for basic research, they have the National Science Foundation, they have the National Institute of Health, they have the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is a sponsors foundation, which finances a lot of basic research in the US, in bio. All that only for basic research. They have venture capital. They have institutional investors. And we explain the role of venture capital and institutional investment in chapter 12. But they also have the BARDA. BARDA is Biologic Advanced Research Development Agency. Why is it the BARDA? In fact, the Americans started with DARPA during the Cold War, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. That's where the basic research has been done. And you need to coordinate resources to very quickly lead to industrial applications. You know where to go. So it's for things where a clear mission, you have the basic technology, and you need to quickly coordinate resources and actors to move from the basic research stage to mass industrial production stage. They did that successfully with the DARPA for Defense and Space in 1950s, the Americans, and they did it with the BARDA for the vaccines. They had the ARN messenger. You know, I am French. The shame on my country is that ARN messenger, the first who saw that was François Jacob, Prix Nobel de Médecine at Institut Pasteur. And shame on us, France didn't come up with a ARN vaccine. Shame on us. Who did? It was the US, because you had the BARDA, and the BARDA, finance many research centers. Some of them succeeded, some of them failed. They told them the risk is on us. They put $12 billion on things associated with COVID, vaccine, diagnostic, therapeutics, capabilities. The total $11 billion. The total for France on the equivalent was $4 billion. So you see, they have a fantastic ecosystem of innovation, which we don't have in Europe. So my dream capitalism is a capitalism that would combine the good side of the American model, the innovation side, with the good side of the European model, protection and inclusiveness. Some people believe that it's or that if you decide to be more innovative, you have to sacrifice on the protection and the inclusiveness. I am totally in disagreement with that. Totally. Look, when the Danes introduced flex security, flex security system that explains Alexandra Roulet findings that I showed above. It's when you lose your job up to a certain level, you get 90% of your salary for 2 years. Then the state helps you retrain and find new jobs. That system not only is good for protection, but it's also good for creative destruction. It makes creative destruction work much better. So that's a reform. That's an and. It makes Denmark both more innovative and more inclusive and more productive, both. Another respect in which is not a trade-off, but a complementarity, it's education and the lost Einsteins. There's been various pieces of work looking at the probability of someone to become an inventor as a function of parental income. That's Bell et al. Paper in the QJE showing based on contemporaneous US data, okay? They show that you are much more likely to invent when you have high earning parents. It's true, Aksigit and co-authors show the same is true on historical data. And here with Otto Toivanen, Ufuk Aksigit and Ari Aitinen, we show that we have a similar J-curve in Finland. It was much more of an enigma for us. Why in Finland, where school is so high quality and free, unlike in the US? And this is because, in fact, high-income parents are highly educated parents. The big channel there is education. The high-earning parents are more educated parents, and they transmit education to the children. So if you have enough generations in Finland, maybe if you continue to put high education effort after a certain number of generations, and you have also homework done at school and all that, the parental income will play much less of a role. We show in Finland that when you control for parental education, the J-curve becomes essentially flat. It's really the channel is parental education contributing to your own education. So that means that if you develop education and high quality education, then you will have much less what we call lost Einsteins. You will have a larger fraction of population who can become inventors. That's good both with respect to innovation, but it's also good with respect to inclusiveness. That's again something where it shows that it's not an or, but an and. I can make both my economy both more innovative and both more inclusive by educating a lot in education, by investing a lot in education and minimizing the scope for lost Einstein. I am almost done now. I want to go back to the initial pessimism, the initial statement about the Schumpeter's pessimism. Schumpeter believed that the first innovators would turn into conglomerates that would prevent subsequent innovation. In fact, you can avert this pessimism through the triangle, market, state, civil society. That's what we analyze in chapter 14 and particularly 15. You need firms to innovate, but you need the state as well. You see, the separation of power in the state may be a way already to prevent a collusion between firms and the executive power. If you have an executive power with good checks and balances by the judiciary and by the legislative power, already that may go some way towards reducing the scope for corruption of executive power holders by the firms. But of course, the problem is that constitutions, even with the separation of power, you can have the best Montesquieu you want. The problem is that constitutions are incomplete contracts, you see, and that I know Thorsten Persson has worked on that with Jean Roland, but I worked on that with Patrick Bolton and with Alberto Alesina, Francesco Trebi. Constitutions are incomplete contracts, and therefore civil society can play a crucial role as a means of ensuring the completion of the contract and the enforcement of the social contract. In fact, the civil society takes constitutional safeguard from theory to being real, you see, from being theoretical into becoming reality. And so you need the triangle, firms, state, civil society. The idea that this triangle is important was already pointed out by Bowles and Carlin in recent work on COVID. But this is very much also the answer to the pessimism of Schumpeter. And let me give you two examples on the role of civil society. The Civil War, you know, when you had the Civil War in the US, after the Civil War, the US Constitution was amended to guarantee equal rights of voting to all races. They introduced the 15th Amendment that gave African Americans the right to vote. Yet many states in the South used poll taxes or unfairly implemented literacy tests to effectively disenfranchise African Americans. And it took the civil rights movement and lots of bloodshed to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banning voters' literacy tests. So you see, that's a wonderful illustration of the role of civil society. There is another one, which is a French one, May 68 and the ability to seize the Constitutional Council. When de Gaulle introduced the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, the Constitution Council could be seized for if you think that the law is not constitutional, but only by the head of the parliament. And those were of the same party as de Gaulle. So up to the 70s, never was the Constitutional Council seized by anybody. But then you had May 68 went by, and Giscard d'Estaing became president a few years after, and himself acknowledged that it was the May 68 movement that compelled him to introduce more democracy in the French system by allowing any group of 60 MPs at least to seize the Constitutional Council. And since then, many times has the Constitutional Council been seized, the Conseil constitutionnel in France, for contesting the constitutionality of a law. And but you see again how civil rights, the civil society plays an important role. I think Macron has learned a lot, that ignoring civil society is not a good thing, because he got the Yellow Vest movement, which we talk about as well in the book. So that's the outline of the book. Paradigm, we explain the Schumpeterian paradigm, what creative destruction is all about, and the outline of the book. Takeoff enigma, the wave enigma, competition and innovation, inequality and innovation, secular stagnation, middle income track, structural change. Can you move directly from an agricultural economy to a service economy that would reduce pollution a lot? If African countries could, and other countries could go directly from agriculture to services, that would reduce enormously world pollution. Green innovation, what I was mentioning before, the role of state and civil society in inducing greener innovation. Behind the scenes, who are the inventors, their parents, how is innovation ranks shared within the firm, the articulation between basic research and applied research, the health and happiness and creative destruction, what I mentioned before, the financing of creative destruction, globalization, the emergence of investor states through wars mainly, and on states through crises mainly, and the magic triangle between firm, state, and the civil society. And at the end, we discuss the future of capitalism. So that concludes, that's what we do in the book. Let me stop there. I've been way too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for an interesting presentation. And we all understand that the book contains a lot of very relevant and important aspects of the situation we're in right now. Personally, I see a lot of threats towards creative destruction. And it's a bit of a contradiction that in the most innovative country, the US, you also see less of social mobility, and it has been on the decline for some time. What do you think, or what is the role played here by the huge platform firms that have monopolized more or less several industries, particularly in the US, and that's shown by John Haltivanger and Thomas Philippon. Their market power has increased and increased. What do we do about that, Philippe? And would you agree that there we have the real problem, so to speak, or what is your view?
Yeah, so the view is that, so that's very much based on the work I do with Thibaut Boppart, Pete Clino, Antonin Bergeaud, and Huey Lee. What we showed is that the average markup in the US didn't go up so much because within firms the markup went up. Labor share didn't go down so much because within firms labor share went down is because the high markup, low labor share firms, which were the superstar firms, became more hegemonic. You see, so at first, when they became more hegemonic, growth was boosted. But then when they invaded all sectors of the economy, they inhibited innovation and entry in those sectors. You see what I mean? And the problem is to adapt competition policy to the digital era. It's not so much that competition policy worsens in itself. It's that it did not adapt to the IT revolution and AI revolution. So there is a very interesting book that we mentioned by Richard Gilbert, who is at Berkeley. We have a whole box on it in chapter 6 of the book, where we explain, Richard Gilbert said the way we do also in Europe, the competition policy, when we decide whether or not to allow the merger and acquisition, we only look at market share. We are very static. You see what I mean? We look at the market share. What we should do is to say, when we decide whether a merger and acquisition should be allowed or not, will it prevent subsequent entry? Will it prevent subsequent innovation? And that should be the criterion to implement competition policy. A big problem they also have in the US is lobbying. We talk a lot about the lobbying. I talked about it in the inequality chapter, but also in the competition chapter. And we need to fight lobbying, to regulate lobbying. There may be the good lobbying, but there is a lot of bad lobbying.
So we need more of a dynamic perspective on competition.
On competition policy, absolutely.
Let me
entry oriented.
Let me invite Carolina. We're running out of time, but you have a question to Philippe, I guess.
Well, let me begin by thanking Philippe for a clear and engaging presentation. It probably would have been even more engaging if we would have been able to see you, but we saw the slides. I mean, the book, let me also mention, I think it's a must read for anyone interested in inclusive and sustainable growth. Which obviously is something that everyone nowadays advocate and want to promote, but more often than not, it's pretty unclear how it could possibly be achieved. And I mean, in order to be able to devise appropriate policies to achieve this, you have to understand the nature of growth, what drives it and how it affects firms, markets, and workers. And I would say that very few people have the depth and width of insights into this than Philippe. And I think you've done a great community service in pulling together all the kind of strands of research that you have been involved in the last few decades into a book that is quite accessible to a more general audience. And there are lots of questions that, of course, one would want to pose to you and to hear your view on, but we don't really have time for that. But what I think maybe when we talked, you talked about this ideal capitalist system blending the American ecosystem for innovation and the European model when it comes to social protection. And I think maybe a lot of people would want to hear your view on China in all of this, since China seems to be a real growth engine in the world economy right now. And from the book, you sort of gather that you still see a risk that they end up in this middle income trap. But that would be interesting to hear your view on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carolina. Thanks so much. You'll be way too generous in your comments. Well, I'm very. You don't see me. You know what good thing of not seeing me? You don't see me blushing. So China is a very interesting model. It's a model of capitalism. It's very interesting because on the social protection side, they provide social protection in state-owned enterprises. There they have, because many social services are associated with being an employee of a large state-owned enterprise. But for those who are not in state-owned enterprise, this is much more precarious. They don't have the same access to social safety net at all. So that they have to come up to break with that problem. That's on the social end. But they have on the innovation hand, of course, we have to commend China's performance. You know, it's amazing what China has got. I mean, we are all impressed by China. They've gone very, very far. They are very close to being a frontier in many areas. One has to commend, the fantastic success of China. The question is, do they face a middle income trap? I think the problem they will face, is that I believe, and I'm working on that with David Stromberg, actually, we believe that freedom is key to making Kuhnian innovation. If you want to make very disruptive innovation, it's much more likely to happen. Nothing, of course, is deterministic in this field, but the probability is much higher to make Kuhnian innovation in an environment with freedom, because you need to be disruptive. You need to be, if only, for example, let me give you an example. Humanities, Zuckerberg, he was a drop-off from Harvard, but he had to take, humanities in Harvard. And humanities are very important because it takes you out of your milieu. You come from a particular family, father, mother, family. When you enter university, you are in forums where you can debate with other people. You can debate at the Kennedy School Forum. In Harvard, you can debate in the humanity courses. I've taught, a course on media with Bénédicte Berner at FAS. We discuss in those classes, and that makes you become more disruptive. You see, you become something else and the pure product of your family and your milieu. And that's why humanities are so important. In a country where you don't have that, where you don't have the humanities, where you can freely discuss, where you don't have that freedom, I think the probability that you can make a very fast-breaking innovation is much lower. You can be a very good imitator. You can even improve at the margin, top technologies. But will you make the next big breakthrough? And we believe with David that we can't. That really freedom is a big part of it. Now, it doesn't mean that China necessarily has to do exactly what the West does. I don't know how they can get there. The other aspect also, which is very important, is that competition is a big driver of frontier innovation. You tend to have less competition in less free environment. Democracy helps reduce corruption and foster competition. That's another reason why you get more escape competition effect in more democratic environment. So that's my belief, is that China can be very good, even improving top technologies, but so far, no breakthrough innovation unless more freedom in one way or another.
Okay, thank you, Carolina, and thank you, Philippe, and thank all of you who attended. And we apologize for the technical problems that we had at the beginning.
Yeah.
But it was a true fascinating presentation, Philippe, and I can just agree. I warmly recommend anyone who is interested in these issues to take part of the book, read the book. It's very accessible, not so many equations as we are used to when we read what Philippe Aghion has written. So it's an opportunity for a broad audience. But with those words, I'm afraid we have to conclude. So again, thanks to all of you, and hope to see you soon again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pontus and Carolina and Britt-Marie for organizing this. It was wonderful. And sorry that you missed my the video, but well, I hope we meet for real soon.
That's right.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.